All right. Welcome, everybody. We're doing something a little bit different today. Today, I'm going to be interviewing Professor Michael Popovic, and I'm really, really thankful to him for joining us, especially because of all the other work I know you've got going on. So that's probably a good place for us to start. Why don't you tell us about all of your different positions, your different roles here at SUNY Potsdam?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. So the roles that I play here at SUNY Potsdam are the following. I am the coordinator for the International Studies program. So that's the major in International Studies and the minor in International Studies. I'm also here in my last semester of being the coordinator for Days of Reflection, Education for Racial Justice and Equity. That's an event that occurs every semester on our campus, usually in October and in March, where we spend multiple days talking about issues related to race and its intersectionality with other dimensions. Then I am one of the two co-coordinators for gender and sexuality here on campus. The other co-coordinator is Kaylee Underhill. And what we try to do is we try to both be a resource for the LGBTQ plus community here on campus, both students as well as faculty and staff. And we are providing training and information for the larger community here on campus so they're better informed about the LGBTQ plus community here on campus. And then lastly, I am starting a new position, the coordinator for the first year program this summer. And the first year program is a program we are starting for the first time in the summer of 2020, where all incoming first years will meet in online dialogue rooms where they get an opportunity to meet their new friends and peers and get an opportunity to engage with each other in a constructive and meaningful way before they arrive here on campus.
Fantastic. So that's a lot of clearly really important work. Some of it connected to some of the other things you're doing. And I'm a nerd for connections. I like to think about systems. I like to think about structures. So I'm curious here. How do you see these different roles being connected to one another? How do they fit with one another?
So the connection that I see between all of these roles is basically, first of all, one of the things that has been something that has been a red line going through my entire life is both the notion of engagement with difference as well as the situation of marginalized groups. Growing up in Germany as an immigrant kid with a last name that clearly put me in the category of being the other, of not belonging to Germany as a nation, kind of allowed myself or gave myself this notion that there is such a thing as the other, and I experienced those kind of notions for the first time there. And that has then been a theme for me in my life. Working to, first of all, empower marginalized groups in ways that I can use my privilege and my skills and abilities to help. But then also this notion of, I think it is really, really important for us to connect with each other across these differences. So that I would say is the second theme that I see here. I enjoy it when people engage with each other, and this is in a variety of different ways. This can be across different cultures, this can be across different ethnic groups, different races. I think there's a lot to be gained when we engage with each other. So I'm trying to promote that in my work as well.
Yeah, that's great. That seems like extremely important work for the world at large generally, but this seems getting to the very core of a liberal arts institution as well. So, in talking about all of these different things you do here on campus and how to bring them together, one of the things that comes to my mind is I've heard you both talk about yourself and myself as social scientists. So, I wanted you to please expand on this a little more. What does that mean to you to be a social scientist? How does that make you think about your work? What's the significance of this?
Yeah, so I would say as a social scientist, one of the things that we do is we study human beings. Of course, this is a subject of study in a variety of different disciplines. So social sciences are studying human beings in the context of their social surrounding. So it's not just a study of the individual, it is the study of the individual in the context of society, the relations to society, groups with each other. So that is the kind of things that we are studying in the social sciences. Me as a trained political scientist, we're looking at, when we look at these human interactions, for example, what are the rules that guide our interactions? And some of the rules that guide our interactions are given to us by the state. We have speed limits, we have all sorts of laws that we ought to abide by, and that shapes how we interact with each other in the social sphere. Um, so as a political scientist, that those are the kinds of rules I would be looking at. What rules are there from the state that guide our behavior? But we know that there are a whole bunch of other rules out there that guide our behavior. Um, you're probably not sitting in a classroom with a whole bunch of people topless around you. There's no law in New York State that would forbid that. For both men and women, it is absolutely legal. However, we don't do that because there are other rules in place, informal rules. So, for example, what social scientists call this is formal and informal institutions. And an institution is here in its simplest definition, just the rules of the game. Some of these rules are written down, some of the rules are not written down, but they're very, very firm. We abide by these. We abide by these rules. So social scientists, this is one of the things that they do. How do these interactions happen? How they are structured? What kind of power dynamics come out of these rules, or what kind of power dynamics go into these rules when we come up with them in the first place. So I would say that is very much the social part of social scientists. But there's the scientist part, that second half of that term. And here what we do is we try to analyze these kinds of things, these interactions between people, in a structured methodological kind of way. Maybe the broadest category would be we apply different versions of the scientific method to a large degree to the analysis that we try to do in the social sciences. There are different versions of what the scientific method is. However, one of the things that distinguishes political scientists or social scientists in general from, let's say, somebody in the natural sciences or hard sciences is that in the natural sciences, we have laws. If I take this pen and I drop it, it will fall down every single time. There's no question about that pen falling or not. I'm not going to do this 100 times, and the 101st time the pen is going to say to me, dude, you can stop already. Gravity, the pen falls. Another example would be, if you look at atoms and molecules, you have two hydrogen atoms hanging out, you have an oxygen atom getting close to them. When they are in proximity, they will attach. There is no if, but, or why. They will attach to each other as water. Now imagine human dating would work that way, and you're walking through the student union and all of a sudden you just get attached to somebody, and that's now the person you're gonna spend the rest of your life with. This is clearly not how this works. So in the social sciences, we basically do not have laws. In none of the social sciences. Some things get somewhat close to laws. Laws here, something that is always true. Some people would say that, for example, the price mechanism gets pretty close to a law. We can debate that. There are certainly arguments against this, but I'm just saying some people would make that argument. But if you think about it, there's one fundamental difference between human beings and the other things that I just talked about, and that is choice. As human beings, we can change our minds, and there can be many, many different reasons why we change our minds. It may be not obvious to others why we have changed our minds, but we have that choice. Of course, not everybody has the same level of choice. Some people have a lot more constraints in their lives where they have very little choice left of what they can do. A lot of people have a lot more privilege and they have a lot more choice. But fundamentally, at least in a theoretical way, we all have some kind of choice that a molecule clearly would not have. So in the social sciences, while we try to be rigorous, while we try to apply, clear rules of how to analyze data, we cannot come up with laws. What social scientists do is they talk about the likelihood of an event happening, or we think, if these things come together, then this is a likely outcome. It would never be when these two things come together, this is exactly what will happen. So as a social scientist, I would say that makes social sciences significantly more difficult than natural sciences. I'm sure folks in the natural sciences may disagree with me, but as a social sciences, I think this is both what makes the study of social sciences really interesting, because there's a lot to analyze, there are a lot of variables, it's difficult to really figure it out, but at the same time, that's also the challenge of social sciences. It's oftentimes hard to come to very, very clear and firm conclusions. So yeah, there are different ways in which we do this, but we try to take a very structured approach to understanding what there is to know about human interactions.
Yeah, thanks. So that's a really nice explanation there of both the social piece and the science piece of social science and some of the complications that arise when we try to bring those together generally. So I want to move in the direction of getting a bit more specific, talking about some of the ways we try to structure things in the social sciences. So I know in your work, game theory comes up quite a bit. So I was wondering, could you please tell us a little bit about how game theory gets used across the social sciences generally?
Yeah, so game theory is a really interesting approach, and it's one that I was exposed to quite comprehensively in grad school. The school that I attended was a school that put a lot of focus on understanding game theory. And if I would have to give you a really broad first taste of what game theory is, I would say it is the attempt to use math and logic to understand human interactions. And here in particular, oftentimes game theory can be very, very helpful when we are trying to understand human interactions that are maybe counterintuitive, where it seems like this is what should happen if we think about the internal logic and everything, but that's not what happens in the real world. And then game theory oftentimes can be helpful for us to understand, how do we come up with this outcome? Why do we land here, even though there is another outcome that seems very much logically consistent? Why do we not end up there? So it is, just like we can use regressions and statistics and so on to express this rigorous approach to understanding human interactions, game theory would be another one. And it's important to understand that game theory gets used in a large variety of different contexts. So somebody who does economics or behavioral economics would look at, why are people making the choices that they're making, and how do these choices impact outcomes in the economic world that we live in? But game theory can also be incredibly important, and was incredibly important, for example, during the Cold War. Before diplomats would sit down with the Soviet Union to negotiate, they would think through scenarios. What are different things that they may be able to say, and how should we then react to it? So they kind of tried to create a strategy based on a rigorous logic that would help them ensure to get the outcomes that they would like to have. So game theory can be used to understand international negotiations. But game theory can also be used, for example, to understand, why does Congress vote on certain things in one way over another? Whose interests are represented here, how much weight do they have, and how can we model this in a way that we can understand this really complex system of how Congress makes a decision, boil it down to the most important parts of it, and then try to understand those really well. So game theory also always basically creates a model. And by a model, I mean it is a simplification of reality. If we try to use all the information that we have about the reality that we are living in, you would be utterly overwhelmed. Just look around you right now in the room that you're sitting in and imagine you would need to pay attention to every single piece that's in the room. That is a lot of information. So game theory tries to look at reality and tries to say, how can I distill this down to its essence and understand that underlying process that is important here.
Yeah, so just like we try to distill the reality down to its essentials here when we're working in game theory, to try to boil this idea down a little bit of what we're doing in game theory. Oftentimes, one of the ways that game theory gets introduced is through this notion of this particular example of the prisoner's dilemma. And I know you've used this in my classes before. So could you just bring us through the prisoner's dilemma as an example of game theory?
Yeah, so prisoner's dilemma is basically the go-to first introduction for almost everybody to the topic of game theory. So let me just give you the scenario really quickly. Prisoner's dilemma is the following setup. Imagine you and somebody else had decided you're going to rob a bank. You rob the bank, you get caught by the police shortly thereafter, but the police says we don't have enough evidence to convict you. We are pretty convinced you robbed the bank, but we don't have enough stuff to hold up in court that we could actually convict you. So imagine you're sitting in an interrogation room, your partner in crime is in a different room, so you cannot talk to them, and the police officer in front of you now says, here are your 4 options. If you cooperate now with me and tell me what happened, so if you confess to what you have done, I will put you in a witness protection program, you go home for free, your partner in crime goes to prison for 20 years. If he does not confess, if he just sits quietly and does not cooperate with me. Now, of course, there could be the opposite scenario. You don't cooperate with me and don't say anything about what you have done, but your partner in crime decides to cooperate with me and tells me everything. Under those conditions, your partner in crime goes home in a witness protection program and you go to prison for 20 years. Now, if you both implicate each other, if you both talk to me, then both of you will get 10 years in prison. If neither one of you talks to me, we don't have enough evidence to throw you in prison for a long time. You're going to be charged on a minor charge. You're both going to prison for 1 year, and that's the end of that story. And then the question is, now what do you do? What is rationally the best approach that you can take to maximize the outcome for you? And maximizing the outcome here means how can you spend the least amount of time in prison? Yeah. And if you look at this, the least amount of time in prison is 0 years, and that's you cooperating and the other person staying quiet. But remember, you don't know what the other person is going to do. So if you now confess and she also confesses, then you're both going to prison for 10 years and you are not getting off free and going into witness protection program. So there's that situation. Now, what should I do? What is the best strategy for me to reach the outcome that produces the least amount of time in prison? And if you think about it, that outcome is both stay silent, 1-1. That would be the best possible outcome. But now think about it. Is that the likely outcome? Is that what would happen? And if you now calculate it through for each option and you try to decide, if she cooperates, am I better off cooperating with the police also, or am I better off keeping silent? And if I was now in your class, I would put this on the board and we could calculate this through. But let me take you to the punchline. The best possible strategy that you could have in that situation is to confess. That overall would produce the likely outcome that you spent the least amount of time in prison. But if the other side does exactly the same thing, then you're both going to prison in 10 years. So this is now here where it's counterintuitive. It is clear that you should stay quiet and both of you would only go to prison for 1 year. But if you think through the logic of all of your choices, you land in the spot where you confess, both sides confess, and then both go to prison for 10 years. So game theory helps us understand how is it that there's clearly a better outcome, but we are not getting there. We are stuck in this suboptimal outcome where neither one of us gets to go home and we both go to prison in 10 years. Without using game theory to understand this dilemma, it would be really hard to unpack to see that there is a logic for the individual. That is the best logic. But there's a second level to it, and that is the logic of the group, because if you could now talk to the other person and make sure that both of you stay quiet, you coordinate that and say, we stay quiet, you could end up in the better outcome. Of course, the important issue here is you need to be able to trust that person, that they will actually stick to what you have agreed to before this situation. But without game theory, it would be really hard to understand these different outcomes. Another really important game that focuses on a different but related dynamic is the tragedy of the commons game. And in the tragedy of the commons game, the issue is there's one piece of land that has a limited amount of grass on it. Everybody in town is allowed to use that field for their sheep. Now, if everybody puts all of their sheep on there, they're going to graze all the grass, there's not going to be any more food, and all the sheep die. So there is a maximum number of sheep that can be on that land. Now, if nobody is there who knows that number, who coordinates that number, it's the question now, what do you do? How many sheep should you put on the field? You want to put as many as you possibly can, because then you can sell the wool and you can make an income. But you don't want too many to be there, because then you're not going to get anything back because your sheep are going to die. So we can use game theory to understand what the optimal level of participation here is to make it so that the grass is still there the next year and everybody gets the maximum amount of revenue from their sheep. But again, there's a difference in the logic for the individual. What is the right strategy? You want to maximize. But the logic for the group is you don't want to maximize, you don't want to exceed the next maximum number of sheep overall. So again, there's a disconnect between those two levels, and by using game theory, we are able to unpack this and understand better how could it be that this piece of land gets overgrazed all the time. And you can think of a number of environmental issues where we see this happening all the time. Don't think sheep, think fisheries, think forests, etc., etc. So game theory helps us in those ways of finding answers to questions that otherwise would be difficult to get a good handle on.
It seems almost as if group dynamics are kind of complex, and it's nice to have a structured system for trying to understand something about those group dynamics.
Absolutely. That's the value of having a model. That's the value of focusing on the things that are the most important drivers. Yes. And that takes a lot of thought and is very, very complicated to do.
So now that you've given us an overview of the prisoner's dilemma itself and how it works out, I was wondering if you could please tell us a little bit about why you think this is significant. Why is the prisoner's dilemma your example of choice when you come and talk to my students?
Well, so one of the ways in which I would put that is it's important because it is just applicable in so many different situations. I mean, it's called the prisoner's dilemma, but like I said earlier, we can apply this to diplomacy and policy making and all sorts of different things. So having that analytical tool allows us to understand a whole bunch of different situations. So that in itself is already very relevant. But then maybe even more relevant for our lives directly is that when we look at policy making, I'm a political scientist, so let's look at the state. For policy making, remember I just said that there is that distinction between individual rationality and the rationality of the group for the community. And both of those rationalities need to be taken into account when policy is being made, because in a sense, policy gives an incentive structure to people to do something or not to do something. And the prisoner's dilemma shows us how people react to rules and what kind of outcomes, and especially unforeseen outcomes, can come out of this. So the prisoner's dilemma is one of the ways in which we can analyze a situation trying to anticipate what people may do given the policy that we may implement. Another component why I think the prisoner's dilemma is a really good first look at game theory is the fact that there is a pretty clear strategy when it comes to prisoner's dilemma that produces overall the best outcome. And that strategy is called a tit-for-tat strategy. What we mean by tit-for-tat strategy is basically, I will do to you what you do to me. So if you're cooperating with me, I will cooperate with you. If you are not cooperating with me, if you're ratting me out to the police, then I will not cooperate with you either. Yeah. So in general, computer simulations and so on have shown that that overall produces the best outcome. But let's qualify that a little bit more. Let's look at this a little bit more closely, what I mean with a good or better outcome. So when we play Prisoner's Dilemma with a group of people a number of times in a row, and then we see how many years of prison come out for the group overall, that would be kind of our measurement of how well this policy does. If it is a good policy, then the overall number of years in prison would be relatively low. If it's a bad policy, that would be high. And we would call it bad because, I mean, if a lot of people spending a lot of time in prison, they cannot be active members of the economy, they cannot be active members of the political and social life of their communities. There's a cost associated with putting people in prison. So the more people we have in prison, based on that policy, the worse that policy would be. So when we look at tit for tat, if we play this in a class and let students use whatever strategy they want to use, they always cooperate with their partner in crime. They never cooperate with their partner in crime. They do it randomly. Now, when we do that and compare the number of years in prison to everybody using tit for tat, in the tit for tat scenario, that number is significantly lower. And what is important here when it comes to the tit for tat strategy, there are a few things that are important about it, but let me highlight two. One, the tit for tat strategy asks you to initially always cooperate. So a fundamental willingness to work with others is something that produces, in the long run, better outcomes that we can measure. The second component of a successful tit-for-tat strategy is not only will you always start with cooperating with the other side, but you will not hold a grudge. So let's say, you and I playing the game, I cooperate and you don't. You rat me out to the police. Now, in the next round, I will not cooperate. I will retaliate. You didn't cooperate, now I won't cooperate. But after I'm done with that retaliation for a successful tit-for-tat strategy, I go right back to cooperation. If you go back to cooperation, I go back to cooperation. So maybe to put it in general terms, tit-for-tat says you cannot hold a grudge. You have to be open to cooperation from the get-go, and you cannot hold a grudge. So I already said that the outcome for the community is better if we use tit for tat versus just random strategies that you could use to interact with each other. Now, if we introduce another component into this, and that would be the component of discrimination. If there's a group of people that by default will not cooperate with a certain other type of person, whatever that other group may be. This could be a racial group, this could be a different socioeconomic group, this could be somebody from another gender. I mean, there are all these different dimensions of discrimination that exist in our society. When we introduce that factor into playing that game, then the number of years in prison goes higher than any of the other alternatives. So by using this, we can mathematically show that discrimination is costly for society. So even if you don't care about discrimination, and you should, um, but even if you don't, but you care about how well society is doing overall, that the country that you are living in does as best as possible so you can live your best possible life, then that should be enough for you to not be willing to engage in discrimination, because if you do, you're making the entire group, everybody, not just the group that you're trying to discriminate against, but everybody in the group worse off. And I think that's a pretty powerful result that we can get out of a relatively simple model of prisoner's dilemma. And I wish more people were aware of this, because maybe some people would consider their attitudes if they know I'm not just hurting the group that I maybe want to hurt, I'm hurting myself and the community at large at the same time. So those would be a couple of examples why I think an analysis with a prisoner's dilemma can lead to very interesting, meaningful, and important results for the group that we want to live in.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So if you don't mind, I'll try to summarize here and tell me if you think I've gone wrong anywhere. So part of what's really interesting about the prisoner's dilemma here is by looking at strategies for the best outcomes in the case of the iterated prisoner's dilemma, we get some general idea that when we're engaging in social interaction, it's not a bad idea to go at things thinking a default state is cooperation. We can't be pushovers, but we've got to let we've got to let bygones be bygones. And this is really, really important here because discrimination sort of runs afoul of that, right? Discrimination both involves taking a default attitude of not cooperating, a default antagonism, and then also gives us grudges being held by thinking of people as being representative of an entire group that you're then willing to let that behavior, let that grudge go to the entire group here. Am I on to something there?
Yep, I would say you're on to it, absolutely.
Okay. Well, this has been really enlightening. Thank you very, very much, Professor Popovic, for joining us, and thanks for all of the important work you do here at SUNY Potsdam.
Well, thank you for having me. And if any of you students are interested in learning more about game theory or policy making or anything in the international sphere, if you're interested in the international studies major, for example, or minor, please feel free to contact me. Of course, right now only by email. Otherwise, I'm in Satterley on the 3rd floor. But yeah, if you look me up in the system under Michael Popovic, Popovic, feel free to contact me with any questions that you may have.
And I'll really encourage you to do so, because I can tell you very clearly from personal experience, he's a great guy to talk to and a great guy to spend time with. Thanks very much, Professor Popovic.